This episode of Talking with Tech is brought to you by Smartbox, assistive technology that inspires you to be who you are. You can find them at thinksmartbox.com. Well, welcome back once again to Talking with Tech. This is Lucas Stuber, joined as always by Rachel Madel. How are you?
I'm good. I'm in Philly right now. I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, but I lived in Philly for 10 years, so loving it. Springtime here, which is great.
And of course by Mr. Chris Begay. How are you?
I'm 3 hours south of Philly. I feel like I should drive up and just visit you, meet you in person for once.
I know. Honestly, we're on the same time zone right now, Chris.
I know, right? How often does that happen?
Well, we're also enjoying some good spring out here, which is weird for Portland. So now that I said that, it's going to start raining any minute. Well, I'm excited to talk today. So we have a really fantastic interview today talking about the concept of AAC agreements. And before we even get into what that looks like for each of us, Chris, do you want to explain what that is?
Sure. Well, the interview goes into it a little bit, but really quickly, it was just the idea that there's so many of us that work in the field of AAC, and we have these little nuanced disagreements, like, what's important and what's not important, and should we focus on this or should we focus on that? And so an AAC agreement meeting, you'll hear how it all came out in the interview, is really meant to be like, what are the things we really agree on? If you're meeting with a team of other AAC professionals and you're going to sit down and decide, you know what, these are the things that we all agree on, kind of universal truths, if you will, that just cover the entire scope of AAC. What would those be? What would they look like? And so the interview is two attempts at that. It's the people that ran the sessions at different conferences that talk about how they tried to come up with those universal truths, which we called AAC agreements.
That being said, so what we did this week is each of us took the time to write down 5 things that we thought were universals. And we haven't talked about them at all, really. So this is going to be interesting. We're going to see where we align. How about Rachel? What's one of yours?
It's really interesting because it was a hard practice to just whittle it down to 5, because I have a lot of ideas on what I think is important, but it was really interesting thinking through the lens of what is universal across every system and every kind of case. We just had an episode about this, but I think modeling is paramount is what I wrote down. And I think it's such an important thing that we can keep reiterating, every time we have the podcast, because it's so integral to the teaching.
I wrote model, and I put without immediate expectation, using least to most prompting. That's how I worded it. But the idea being that, you just don't grab someone's hand and grab them and make them push a button. There's a whole prompting or hierarchy that you go along with that helps people. Like first you kind of glance down and just kind of look at it, give them that extended wait time. That might be the first prompt. And the last prompt would be maybe using a physical prompt. So yeah, I think that we align. Yeah,
that's what I had written down was really similar, Chris, to what you wrote. Well, and Rachel both. I had written down, and I might have been colored a little bit because I've been looking at the AAC agreement documents, which I know the interviews will cover, but I had written there also that there was no expectation or judgment around what the response would be to the modeling, right? That we can't assume that the child's immediately going to be recreating what we're doing, and we can't assume that every utterance is going to be grammatically perfect, but that we're still excited about modeling. So, and we did just have a fantastic episode about that too. So if you didn't catch it, give it a listen. What about Chris? What's one of yours?
Teach core vocabulary, but remember that it's only one piece of the puzzle. I think that's something pretty much universally agreed on, that core vocabulary needs to be the focus of instruction, but it's not all instruction. It's just the focus of most instruction. What do you guys think? Was that on your list?
Core words are essential. That's what it says on my list. So absolutely. I think you make a really good point though, Chris. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? It's kind of a balance, right? We don't only use core words. Sometimes those fringe words can be really motivating, but we do know from research how absolutely essential they are in giving children the tools to create sentences and say whatever it is they want to say whenever they want to say it.
And for me, it comes back to this, and it's more philosophical, right? It's a little bit fluffy, but this idea of access to activities of daily living. What I mean by that is that access not just to this sort of like pure functional request refusal sort of system, which obviously is important too, but also access to social communication.
Right. And that's something that, it's easy to just focus on helping a child get their needs met, right? Like requesting is, often where we start, but it's definitely not where we should finish. And there's so many uses of language. And I think that our AAC learners absolutely deserve the same opportunities to tell jokes and to protest and to comment and all these things. So, just thinking about universal AAC truths, I feel like focusing on reciprocal interactions is so important to remember, and something that we always need to be reminding people that we're training and parents and, everybody needs to kind of have that reminder, because it's easy to get stuck in just kind of getting the basic needs met.
Wow, you put that better than me. Great. Okay, well, back to you guys. All right, so we've got three. So we've got modeling, we've got core words with some complexity to it, so core as well as fringe, just making sure we have appropriate vocabulary. We have this idea of the social reciprocity being embedded into the use of the device. What else?
I have one. Here's how I worded it. Believe they will. Just simple.
Yes.
Believe they will. And what I mean by that is specifically believe the students will, but also those of us acting as communication coaches to try and teach the communication partners how to be better communication partners. I also have to believe they can do it, believe that they'll become better communication partners. So in all aspects, believe they will.
I really love that, Chris. Actually, it's dual. Right? It's believing in the children and believing in the, paraprofessionals, caregivers, you name it. I have something similar. Believe that children are capable of amazing things and they'll rise to the challenge. I think that it starts with that belief, and we should never be limiting what we think a child's capable of, and always reminding ourselves, and not only that, but the caregivers and all the people that we're doing training with, that children are capable of amazing things, and we'll never find out what they're capable of if we don't give them the chance.
We're getting back to this concept of presuming competence, right? Not just on the part of the communicator, but also on the part of everyone else that's learning to support them. One way that I've heard it put that I really like is that a child is only ever able to communicate the bare minimum of what they want to communicate. That we're only seeing the tip of that iceberg, and so the more that we can facilitate, the better. One of the things that I had down was just core raw access to the communication device. That the device should always be accessible, within reach, available in leisure activities and academic, contexts all throughout the day. Is that at all aligned with anyone else?
It's essential, right? If we're going to teach kids how to use AAC, it has to be around. How are we going to model on it if it's not around? So I think all of ours kind of rely on the assumption that the device is there in every, capacity. So one thing that I wrote down, the goal is always SNUG. And SNUG stands for Spontaneous Novel Utterance Generation. It's a really fun acronym, but it's so important because, we need to give children the tools to say spontaneous thoughts. And I think in the beginning and with some things, we can use quick fire phrases or social phrases or scripting to kind of teach some functional language, but we really need to create opportunities for children to generate their own utterances. That means putting words together. And that's why core words are so essential. That's why modeling is so essential, because we first have to give the building blocks, which is the core words. And then we have to model and show how we combine those to, talk about the experiences that we're having. It's just really important for us as practitioners to impress upon the staff and the parents how important that actually is, because I think it's easy to kind of get stuck in, having an I want button that says I want, instead of building it's two words. And sometimes I think we make that leap to I want. We start with nouns and then we make the leap to I want. Kids don't understand that that's two different concepts. So instead of saying I want, like maybe they want to say mommy wants or you want. So if we make that leap, we're really not doing the teaching behind it. And sometimes kids can pick it up and it's fine, but other times kids, they don't have the comprehension. So it's just really important to kind of look at those single units and how we can put those together spontaneously.
Yeah. When I talk about SNUG, I often see people go, yeah, right. And they give examples, and it's often examples that are SUG, where they leave out that novel piece, right? Yeah. And the idea with the novel piece is that we can say whatever we want to say. Like right now I could be like, I'm sitting in my closet and my wife's shoes just fell off the rack because a little gnome fell from the sky. No one has ever heard those words put in that sentence before, ever. And that's the novel piece, right? And if I can do that, and Lucas can do that, and Rachel can do that, and anyone else can do that, why wouldn't we assume that someday, given the right tools and the right teaching and amount of time, that our students could do that too.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that too, that's why literacy is so important and keyboards are so important. And whenever I talk about that, I always give an example of this student that I work with who loves making pipe cleaner people. He makes people out of pipe cleaners, and he names them the most random names, like Sige and Biff and all these nonsensical names. If he didn't have a keyboard to type to me, I would never have insight into his pipe cleaner people's names. So it's just, in order to have true novel abilities, I mean, we try our best to program every single word that, a child or an adult could want to say, but that's impossible. So we really need the ability to have those keyboards and those literacy skills as a foundation so that it really can be novel, which is so important.
Sige and Biff are both great gnome names too. We can combine those. No, I actually, I'm glad you said that, because we've already said my 5, but there was the last one I was going to stick in there was literacy. That the ultimate goal I have of any intervention is to get to, functional literacy, both receptively and expressively, because that opens up this whole new world of the N in snug.
So one of mine was consider motor planning from the very beginning. So consider or plan for motor planning or motor memory, something like that.
And so how do we do that?
Well, it's just got to be thinking conscientiously when you're choosing a communication system at the very beginning. Where are you going with this? Am I knowing that I'm going to someday have to change the motor plan? If so, okay, when and how and why are you making the student change the motor plan? Because maybe they can relearn the motor plan, but why would you do that to them? So I don't know. It's just being strategic about it. Is from the planning stage at the beginning. Almost every single successful communication user I know uses some form of motor planning.
Yes, absolutely. And kind of a real life example of what that looks like is I work with a lot of kids who are pretty young, kind of emergent communicators. And there's this idea that, because maybe they don't have the fine motor skills, we're going to start with really big buttons. And in theory, that makes sense, right? It's like, oh, give them 8 buttons. It'll be great. They don't have any words yet, 8 buttons. But then what happens is, they learn the motor plans, they're using these words. And then it's like, well, we need more vocabulary. We need more words. And then what do we have to do? We change the grid size. And changing the grid size means changing all the motor plans. So, what I try and do with the assessments that I'm doing is I try to get the largest grid size possible and then mask a lot of the words. So, maybe we have 8 words, but we have a really big grid with lots of room to add words to it. Because, go is going to stay in the same place go is from the start to the from the beginning to the very end. And that's just something that's really important to think about, that long-term picture, because where a child is at now is not where they're going to be in a week, in 6 months, in 6 years. So it's really important to look at the long-term picture.
Did you find your list, Rachel?
I did. It's here. Okay. So I said, when in doubt, give more words, not less. So this is something that comes up a lot in my practice. And I think I work really closely with ABA therapists. So I think that's probably partially why, this idea that kids don't know these words and we don't want to overwhelm them. So it's hard because we're the gatekeepers of what a child's able to say and have access to say. So whenever you're in doubt, always give more words, because, we never want to limit what a child's able to say. And I do realize that, especially when children are just learning language, maybe we can't have 100 icons for them to scan and learn. But when in doubt, just always err on the side of more.
Yeah. What's the least restrictive option? If I'm not sure which one do I pick, well, I'm going to go with the idea that more words is what I should do until the student proves to me that they can't do it. Then I'll take it back. Then I'll start with the masking. But if I'm not sure, give them more. And how do you, just today, I was working with some communication partners, paraprofessionals, doing kind of initial training for them. And I was like, see how this student here, a student I hadn't seen before, they had masked a bunch of the words. And I was like, how do you model if all the words are masked? Just start modeling on there. And during very specific strategy sessions, like our therapy sessions, you can sit down and do masking if you need to, but not leave it masked all the time. How else can you model?
And that's a really good workaround that I use all the time. Like, listen, ABA, when you're running your programs, you can mask a few of these, but it can never stay masked. Like, it needs to be available. And that's something that I'm really good at. If I'm, really trying to target a specific word, I'm like, oh, we're really having a hard time. Let me see if I mask a few of these buttons and maybe we'll have more success. But, you better believe that, like, unmasking as soon as that activity is over, even sometimes in between activities, because, we can't take words away, right? We can try our best to manage the teaching with, having access to everything all the time, but we don't know what a child needs to say and wants to say. And we just need to have them have access to all of the words. End of story.
Oh, all of the words. You ever seen that meme with that little?
Yes.
All of the words. That's what I want to see.
Teach all the words. I like that.
Teach all the words. Yeah. I have one last one. I don't know. Does anyone else have any?
I got my 5.
I'm excited.
All right. The last one that I have is just 2 words long. Have fun. Right? Language is fun. It's about having fun with the kids. Like you said, it ties back to the social one, I think, Lucas. But the idea that this is fun, man. School is fun and being with kids is fun, and it should be fun for you and it should be fun for them. And when you're having fun, language explodes. It comes out of people. So have fun.
100%. Which ties into a big theme about motivation too, that we talk about, is like make sure that there's a reason to use the language, right? I grew up as a huge disciple of Calvin and Hobbes. There's this great one that I love that where his dad is sitting down with him and he's getting some poor grades in school, and he goes, you love reading. Like you read a book about dinosaurs every single night. Why aren't you doing well in school? And Calvin replies, because we don't read about dinosaurs. So that's if the student wants to talk about dinosaurs, I'm so happy to talk about dinosaurs.
We need that motivation piece, because starting a system, we need that buy-in. So we need, like, hey, this is that cool thing where you can, like, talk about things that might even be inappropriate in some people's eyes. I mean, I work with little boys and they're constantly talking about, like, farting and, like, just gross things. And guess what? Like, I'm the one helping them do that. Sometimes, teachers are like, whoa. I'm like, listen, this is what little boys talk about. So we just need to give them that same access.
If you don't know what Fortnite is, maybe you should go learn what Fortnite is. Because that's what, if you're working in middle schools and high schools, that's what kids are talking about. And that would be super engaging for students. So you got to be kind of clued in on what the cultural references are. Do you know what the Infinity Gauntlet is? You should probably go, because every kid has gone and seen that movie and their friends are going to be talking about it. So you want to talk about the Avengers, whatever is fun and relevant for the student, that's what you should do. And it'll be more fun for you.
I also think there's an element of social peer acceptance, right? Like when a peer hears a kid on a device talking about farting or whatever, all of a sudden they feel more connected. They think it's funny. Everyone's laughing, which is the whole point, right? So I think that there's just, a huge social element when we start allowing kids to sound like other kids. I love using those kind of like fun, like silly and stinky and like all these like, really fun words that we can use to just have fun.
Well, with all that said, I think it's probably time to get into the interview. So we're going to hear from Shaun Pearson and Chichoskikelly, who joined Chris Begay to talk about the AAC agreements, which were presentations both in 2016 and 2018 at ATIA. So we'll touch on some deeper dives into some of these issues. You're listening to Talking with Tech. Today's show is sponsored by Smartbox, makers of speech-generating devices carrying their signature AAC software Grid 3, which is one of the most popular worldwide. Grid 3 used to only be available for Windows, but now with Grid for iPad, the options for continuity across platforms have really opened up. For thousands of kids and adults around the world, using Grid 3 gives them the ability to really participate in all forms of communication with as much control as possible. Grid 3 does that by seamlessly incorporating everything from literacy curriculum to text-based grids, all while having access to social media, photos, movies, phone calls, all in one place. All these features of Grid 3 evolve with the person while they communicate, participate, and be who they are. From iPad to eye gaze, Grid 3 is an incredibly comprehensive AAC solution. Go to ThinkSmartbox.com for a free 60-day download of Grid 3. It's one of the great options to consider for every person needing AAC.
Well, welcome to Talking with Tech. And today I have interviewing two people at once today. I've got Chris Chichoskikelly, and then we also have Shaun Pearson. Guys, thank you for both being here. Chris, where are you from and what do you do? Let's give some people some background.
I'm from Vermont, and I work in the Essex Westford School District, which is near Burlington. I am the AT Integration Specialist for that district. I am not a speech-language pathologist. I'm a techie with video and an aptitude for picking up tech.
Awesome. All right. And Shaun?
I'm a speech-language pathologist and assistive technology specialist. I work in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where we just got spring right now, so it's very exciting. And I work for a not-for-profit organization called Renfrew Educational Services, where we provide assistive technology services for students 5 to 21 years of age, as well as I'm a private practitioner, a lot of different hats, so to speak.
Awesome. Well, welcome to you both. What we're here to talk about today, this particular interview, is about something called AAC Agreements. And so, Chris, do you want to kind of kick it off, explain how this kind of came about, kind of start the story off?
Yeah, well, I guess it was about 3 years ago when I met you at ATIA in February of 2016, a little over two years ago, I guess.
Uh-huh.
And we went to EdCamp. And I had this idea that we could try to collate some information about agreements and disagreements in the AAC field. I was trying to make sense of where the field was. There don't seem to be, declarative best practices. And in talking with you, I really wanted to try to pull together some positives and maybe some things where people needed to put some energy and research.
Your goal of that particular conference, I think, was to try and figure out AAC. When people go to ATIA, it's the Assistive Technology Industry Association conference, they often wear different hats and they're looking for different things. Like sometimes I go looking for reading and writing supports, and I'm looking for the latest in vision equipment, help people with visual impairments. And it's a large conference with lots of different focuses, and you could totally go there for AAC as well. And my understanding is that's what you were there for. Like you were laser focused on trying to figure out AAC. Is that correct?
Prolo at the time was revolutionary, but it was categorical based. Then Touch Chat was sort of the next big one, and then Words for Life had come out and a whole bunch of other ones, and it was sort of overwhelming to our system on what to pick at that time. And what are the differences between them, and how should we be implementing them? And those were the questions I was arriving with.
Yeah, and then you go to the conference and you go to different sessions, all specifically focused on AAC, and you hear different messages from different people. Am I summing that up right?
Did hear a lot of different messages from different people, but at the same time, there were different foci. Some core was just beginning to be a really big focus. The group at UNC Chapel Hill was doing a lot of work on that at that time. And that was something that was new. Aided daily language input was a big thing that a lot of people were just really starting to explore, and a lot of SOPs at that conference had not heard of. It seemed. And so, when I went to all those different sessions and talked to different people, and I kept running into you and talking to you about them, those were some of the common themes. And as I started to pull those together, it became clear that any app we supported had to have support for those functionalities. It had to be able to support core. It had to be able to be a full breadth and depth of language, and trying to pull all those commonalities together in 50 hours and over 4 days was exciting, exhausting, and culminated in this EdCamp experience. We were able to pull together about 20 people and sort of talk about what were some agreements. It seems clear to me without an SLP background, but with a lot of experience of implementing AAC with SLPs, there's no one right way to do it. And at the same time, the field doesn't have consensus on even the best ways to do it. And you and I went back and forth about some disagreements we had.
I remember those conversations fondly because it's one of those things where you grow from going like, well, I think it's this way, but no, but that doesn't make sense because what if we twisted it this way? You had this idea to put the AAC Agreements session up at EdCamp. And I know there were some big names in the field sitting there with us. I know Carol Zangari was there from Practical AAC, Carol Ann Musselwhite, Linda Burkhart, and then there were others too, trying to really wordsmith what would we all agree on. And so that was the 2016 version.
I got the go-ahead to go back, and I reached out to you and said, all right, great. Let's revisit this at EdCamp again. And I got the bad news that it was your turn not to go.
Yes. I said, but I know a guy. I know a guy
That's right.
who can do this. And so, Shaun, do you want to talk about how you got involved?
Sure. I got a call from you, I think, maybe the month before or 6 weeks before ATIA. I think you knew I was going, and just informing me about the agreements, which I think I had seen online. I think you tweeted them, or I had seen them before. And you just asked me, kind of gave me the rundown of what happened, how the process was in the past, and you asked me if I wanted to kind of facilitate a session at EdCamp with Chris, because you couldn't go.
Tell me how it went, because I wasn't there. So
yeah, so it was, I think from the way Chris described it, it was very similar. I think we had 12 to 15 people. There were probably a handful of people or a few people who were at the previous one, the one 2 years ago. So we did that, and what we did was we brought up all the agreements from the 2016 one and shared them with people in case they didn't see them. And then our first step was to kind of go over everything, go over all these agreements and see if A, anything changed for people, or B, if people disagreed with what they were reading with the previous agreements.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe now, I don't know if you guys think this or not, but I'm wondering should we break out what those agreements are and talk about them a little bit? The first one I'm seeing is the communication system should allow for multiple pragmatic functions. That seems makes sense to me. There's so often I think we get stuck on requesting, right? And what else can we have people do? Comment, request, all the other pragmatic functions.
In the previous set, we'd said allow for all pragmatic functions. So this became a compromise with this group. I'm not sure which way is better. This is a little, it turns out, and we'll see that as we go through these, some of the ones in 2016 were a bit strident. They were a little more inflexible, and this allows for a wider range of systems.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder, just talking about it for a second, what pragmatic function would you not want it to allow? It'd be a good I wish I was there, because it'd be a discussion to have, should it be all or should it be multiple? I could see that being a point of contention with people. But the idea is you shouldn't have just one, I think is the big takeaway, right?
And I think this one went around the table quite a bit. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, in terms of the discussion, and it's something I'm sure we'll get to after, but just the wording of things, because the way I kind of took away from it, it's a slight change from the way it was before, but this one definitely went around the table quite a bit.
Let's look at the next one. So the next one says, everyone is a multimodal communicator. A communication system should include multiple modalities.
And so by saying it should include the multiple modalities, they're saying, it should have text, it should have audio, but it doesn't necessarily have to all the time, and so they were just making it a little wider, a little broader.
Cool. Yeah. Contrasting it with one from 2016, there's one, and unless I'm missing it in the 2018 version, there's one in 2016 that says there should always be a light tech option as part of an AAC system. And I'm wondering, is that what this new one morphed into, or is that something?
No, that one's still there. I don't think we didn't get to that one. It'll be interesting to see. No, we did get to that one, as I recall, Shaun, right? Yeah. And that one did not have much disagreement on it. Everyone saw the validity of having something could be laminated at the pool, or when a battery dies, or when the machine gets dropped. And so that was an important agreement that was pretty consistent.
I know that's a conversation we've been having around these parts is about, I like how it's worded in that it's an option and that, or you said multiple modalities in the other one, meaning so often it's been called a backup system, but I don't think of the backup system anymore. I think of them as alternative systems. Just like Chris, you were just nodding, like, yeah, I understand. Like, that nodding is not your backup system. It's just an alternative system for you to say, yeah, I'm understanding you, right? Sean's nodding now too.
Yeah.
When you're helping a student swim in the pool and you want them to answer a question or make a choice about what their free time thing is, do you really want the iPad in the pool?
Right.
So is that a backup if you're using a laminated set of sheets with some choices on it?
Well, I don't know.
To your point, that may not be a multimodal system at that time,
Well, I'm thinking that all of those things are part of the grand system, So
Right.
not like the iPad is the system, but that the communication system of the person, an iPad is one part of it, and that laminated board is one part.
Well, and that was a conversation where we actually struggled a bit this February at ATIA in 2018 because really we had a lot of conversations about that. Is the app the system or is the system not? So we sort of revisited that. I think if I were to do this in the future, I would sort of try to set out some definitions of what what an AAC system is or what a communication system is. And that's language that we sort of parsed a lot with this group of 15 at ATIA this winter.
That's something that I always find very tricky, is that there doesn't necessarily seem to be one definition that we could go to. We can't go to Merriam-Webster and be like, "Oh, communication system," and then here's the definition of it. So I think that's a reason why we kind of struggled with that, and everyone was kind of going over and over, and we'll get to a couple that I think should be in any definition of communication system, but I think that was an issue. I'm assuming ASHA or whoever does have something, because I know our national governing body, they do have an official statement on, this is what a communication system or an AAC system, I think their thing is. I'm assuming ASHA has something similar. But then, for instance, in Canada, sometimes you have the national body, but then you have the provincial body, so the equivalent of the state. So they might say something that might not be consistent with what someone else is saying.
I think we had 10 different ASHA members probably in that group, and they were not agreeing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe it needs to be defined. I think it's a great idea, but it's certainly not codified at this time.
All right, let's look at the next one. It says a single switch or sequence switch device is appropriate to use as a component of a multimodal communication system. So that seems appropriate to me. Yeah, right? Like however the person needs to access the device, they access the device, whether that's a switch or it's eye gaze, if it's direct select, or whatever, right?
I think the main point, which may have been wordsmithed out of this a little bit, was it's really not a great, robust system if it can't be controlled with a single switch. We're trying to be positive, but I think the takeaway from this one briefly is if you can't access it with a switch or sequence switches or multiple switches, it's not a great system.
Gotcha. Yeah. Right. You are knowingly, if you're a developer and you're knowingly leaving out that population, then it's not a great system because you wouldn't even consider it for a population if it was only direct select.
Well, and for people like me who are on the periphery, it's not a full-time, focus. When I'm parsing or looking at different systems, in some ways I need to look at what is above the bar of acceptable. And if it doesn't have this, then it's really not a system that I'm going to want to adopt in my school system.
Well, let's see. We have some other ones.
Modeling should be used to facilitate growth and communication. I mean, that's a big new to this whole industry, it feels like, point in the last 5 to 10 years. And not everyone is on board with that. And when we have, in Vermont, we call them paraeducators or paraprofessionals, but in other places they might call them educational assistants. We have, in Vermont, that's been a goal, is to try to get some of the paraprofessionals to model more with AAC, and they don't understand intrinsically that it might take them 200 times to model that before the student will do it.
Yeah, or 2,000.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
No.
And so I think that is a crucial building block. And luckily, I think that is an agreement that is fairly widespread in the industry at this time.
Yeah. Shaun, you're nodding. You agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree too. What I find here is that modeling, it's easy enough to wrap your brain around, right? Yeah, you just got to model on the device. What I find, so why aren't more people doing it? I think it's because it's a skill. You know, like you have to teach it to somebody, and it takes time to learn it, and so you have to coach them through how to model appropriately, or just model in general. You know, because it's so something that doesn't come natural to somebody. You know.
Well, not only that, as you said, there's a steep learning curve. And in our system in Vermont, there are no funds to pay for training hardly, which is a huge problem for support staff. If the model I've been approaching now, and I think you and I talked about it a couple of years ago, my special educator takes over the class of 15 kids, 3 with intensive special needs, and I go train 6 support staff for 45 minutes. And he's like, I got it, no problem, which is revolutionary to me. Genius guy to say that. And then we can do some training because there are no funds to pay for people to stay after school for training. It's a voluntary. So who's going to do that?
Yeah. It's a big issue. Do you have the same issue in Canada, Shaun?
It's finding that the resources, which are largely financial, but also time for everyone to be able to do that, and really, making it clear that this is how we learn language, that this is why we have to model. It's the same thing when we, as a speech therapist, when we're teaching late talkers how to talk, we're doing modeling. That's what we do. And, just teaching people that that's what it is. And being aware that it's not always that easy. I have a little baby daughter now, and I can't tell you how many times I say to her, say this or say that or say this or say that, which as a speech therapist, I would never tell a parent to do, right? I would never tell a communication partner of an AAC user, keep saying, press this, press that, press that, press that, right?
Right.
It's for whatever reason, it's not intuitive to us. So it does involve a lot of teaching, and it is a learned skill.
Okay, let's look at the next one that I wanted to jump to. Accept any mode of communication is valid as long as your communication partner understands what it means. Don't require individuals to repeat themselves in another modality. Do model the response in the modality you are trying to teach.
I think the main point is, a lot of the sessions that people are talking about, again, are sort of best practices. So some of the sessions I saw in 2016 were about SLPs who were not doing this. And people who were presenting were showing some of the SLPs they were trying to teach, and they were sort of showing the errors. And some of them were, I see you chose the red bear. Now say red bear. Now press red bear on your talker, and they were like, what, this is, we already got red bear. Wouldn't you be frustrated if someone made you say something 3 times, 3 different ways? And then, so all you need to do is, and what we added, I think this time, Shaun, was, in case you want to add on, do model the response in the modality you were trying to teach. So if somebody signs Red Bear because they want to read that book that's called Red Bear, then you can look on the device or whatever part of the system you're using and say, oh, you want that book? Great, just as you would when you're trying to teach someone to speak. I think that may have been one of the bigger learning moments from this year's AAC Agreements session at EdCamp.
Okay, so I was just noticing that there are other ones that might fall, other agreements here that might fall in the realm of modeling. So they're kind of all associated with modeling. So let me read this one. Modeling should allow for growth in the individual's communication. The other one is modeling needed language stimulation all day, every day is desired in AAC with no requirement of a response. And so that one was from 2016. I don't think that changed much. Did it?
It did a little bit. We changed it to is desired. Okay. It was a little more, strident or firm language before, and it was softened a little bit here.
Yeah, I get it. It's a little more forgiving if you're trying to do all day, every day, but if you can't. I mean, I think the big thing here, though, is the no requirement of a response, right? where I think a lot of people might have been like, oh, what does that mean? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. No, I think we were talking before, to understand that it might take you a year to get 4 responses built in, which means that the team is modeling that hundreds of times with no expectation of a response for months on end. And I think that is a game changer for some people in the field.
Yeah, it's hard to hear. And I think one of the things that speech therapists jump to is, well, how do I collect data on that? Because you're supposed to be collecting data on what the student's doing, and you're just telling me to model. It's like, well, you still collect data on what the student's doing. The data collection shouldn't drive that, it shouldn't negate this point.
Well, and you can also keep data on how many times you've modeled it.
Yes, right?
Yeah. Modeled, and in conjunction with the other point, modeling should allow for growth in the individual communication. What level of communication are they at? And are you modeling the next level up? We started to have some conversation about that, I think, Shaun, this year, and we ran out of time.
Yeah.
As I think we did in 2016, which was sort of interesting that I think, as I recall, that happened both times, and really starting to dig into that conversation about, we're going to model at the level you're at, and we're going to model at the level above where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's similar to reading. We're going to have you read text at your pace, and we're going to have you try to read text at the class, your age level, you know what I mean? As anything that's behind like that, you want exposure to the next level up.
Yeah, I think of it like a staircase, so a kid on a stair and you stand on that stair or one stair above them, What that means language-wise is if they're saying 2 words, then you say 2 words and occasionally 3 words. Right?
Yeah, so and I go back to what I mentioned before. That's how we teach late talkers and how we teach parents and family members how to model on that. Same thing.
Am I missing any other ones that have to do with modeling in general?
I don't think so. But one thing I definitely want to bring up that I find interesting that Chris mentioned earlier is that, 5, 6, 7 years ago, modeling wasn't in the conversation. And now you look at this list, we have 4, 5, 6 different things that are all related to modeling. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing that has come along with the advent of these AAC devices that are becoming more and more ubiquitous,
Well, and I think I agree with Shaun. I mean, to see that change in the system in the, 12 to 15 years I've been in the AT field, it's huge. I mean, I remember where if it wasn't a Dynavox, it pretty much wasn't an AAC.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And you needed like an extra backpack to carry it around. And then the whole introduction of iPads, which I think changed the world. I want to share a story Samuel Sennett told when I first went to ATIA. He said, assume that there are 300 million people in the U.S. He said, I know there are more. He said, the last survey said that 1.5% to 2% of people could use some type of augmentative alternative communication in the U.S. Let's assume that's 1%. He said, all right, so that's on the low side. That's 1 million people in the U.S. alone could use AAC. He said last year, 12,000 devices were approved by the federal government for funding. He said, there's room. He said, I know all these companies are afraid of a $500 app or whatever, but we still have 800,000 people we're not reaching because of cost. Mm-hmm. This is a good thing, and I will never forget that story.
So that is a fantastic story, and it's so true. Like, I think there's still a huge need out there, and you're just talking about the U.S., let alone globally, Yeah.
Right.
All right, some of the other agreements. Now, there's probably people driving their car right now going, when are they going to say it? When are they going to talk about what vocabulary should be taught? Everyone rest assured, we're getting to it. It says right down here, fringe vocabulary should know. What does it say?
Fringe vocabulary only.
Yes. But it says core vocabulary should be taught. That's the agreement. But I wonder if in the softening realm, if we would not expand that to all vocabulary should be taught, core vocabulary should be taught primarily or something like that. I wonder if there's any issues with that.
I think in the interest of time, I think we got to this one towards the end, Chris. This is much like you're saying, this is one I would have had an issue with. because I would like to see a little bit more of what you mentioned, of all vocabulary should be taught, that we shouldn't forget fringe vocabulary, even if we're focusing on core vocabulary. And that's something I would have definitely brought a discussion about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like in some ways maybe the industry has gone a little too far towards core, and I can accept that point. At the same time, I saw the group from UNC Chapel Hill and Karen Erickson present this year at ATIA, and they're down to 36 core words, and they've refined them, and they all have to have multiple meanings, and they've parsed them. And as a starting point, I think that's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think most people would agree with that, right? Yeah. The question I think that everyone has, and I don't think we're going to solve it today, but is how do you take the core vocabulary and the fringe vocabulary and put it in a blender and mix it, and so that someone comes out on the back end knowing it all,
Mm-hmm.
What's
right.
the magical formula for all of that,
Well, I think the point to elaborate on what you're saying is that that project, which I think is amazing. I've seen them present at both the last two ATIAs, and I will look for them again next year.
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying you're never going to get to fringe. They're saying if you start with fringe, you're not going to get as far as fast as if you start with core. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a slightly more subtle, nuanced point that is valuable, right? Here's your bang for your buck with kids that have 3 words. And totally. I think that's just logical and is really smart, and unfortunately is not as widespread as we want it to be yet.
One of the issues that I take with it, not issues like disagreeing with, but one of the points I make along those same lines is you only have so many minutes in the day. And so with all of these words to teach, where do you want to focus your time? And so that's one of the reasons I gear towards core vocabulary, is because of how much you could use it in that time. All right,
for sure.
Let's move on. There's another one here that's there's a couple here that kind of go together, I think. One is called the AAC system should never be removed for disciplinary reasons. Same lines, there's one that says the student should have access to their communication system even while engaging in academic or leisure activities.
Right, and I think
Sorry, there is one more. The AAC system should always be immediately accessible to the user.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are all variations on a theme, as you point out. I think we had definitely started with, again, in 2016, the first two. It should be immediately accessible, and then it should be never removed for disciplinary reasons. There were times that I think people, and I even see it today with other expensive equipment, people are like, well, should the student carry that because it's so much money, And I was like, well, that's how they access the curriculum. So let's buy a new one or buy insurance.
Right.
Right. It's the same sort of thing. So, we don't want to remove things for disciplinary reasons. Everyone seemed to agree on both sessions. But I think, again, engaging in academic or leisure activities, I think that there are, the point was that a lot of times people are like, oh, well, they're not in class now, so they don't need it. Okay, so you're never going to talk when you're not in class?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the thing people don't stop and think about. It's so funny because it's you have to put yourself in those shoes and say, this system is that person's voice. They should always have it.
Mm-hmm. So a couple quick things here then. So let's say a student is stimming on a device. They keep pressing, want, or they flip over and they go over to the keyboard and they're just going like QWERTY, QWERTY. The reaction for a lot of people would be to take the device away. So just like we were saying before, well, what do you do if the student is having a disciplinary?
Right. I mean, I've got a couple ideas off the top of my head. I mean, the first thing you can do is change and most of the apps, the robust apps, you can change the settings so that it won't say the word again within a certain time. Mm-hmm. So you can slow that down. So the last one I looked at, I can't remember if it was Touch Chat or Prolo, but I think you could go above a second. Mm-hmm. So that's going to change the effect that they're getting. The second thing is if they're going to the keyboard and you don't want them to go to the keyboard, on an iPad, you put them in guided access. And for people who aren't familiar, guided access is Apple's nice way of saying we're locking you into this app and blocking certain buttons from you. Mm-hmm. And I use that with a lot of our students who just automatically go to different things. what's interesting that I've found over the years is the students that are going to things that we don't want them in at that time are doing it intentionally.
Yes, right?
They like the photos because they like people.
Yeah.
They don't do photos. Well, right? So then it becomes about what are we, and we haven't really got this in the agreements, but what is the motivation? If the student is motivated, they can do it. So then in our teaching, you know, and PRC actually has Prinky Romick actually has a lot of nice things about this. I'm sure other people do, but in really just talking about the teaching moments as finding the motivating things to tie in language with students so that they won't just stim. And so I think that's the real educational point. Instead of blocking and corralling, you need to encourage that motivation and channel it towards increased communication.
And something to kind of jump on what Chris said is what I always tell the teachers and professionals, paraprofessionals that I work with is it's their voice. So the same way you would treat another student who's talking during class and who might be, you know, scripting or being repetitive in class, you treat that child, that user the same way. So if you're telling them, if you would tell another kid, shh, quiet voice, or, you know, indoor voice or whatever, you tell a student who's using a device the exact same thing, you know, and something that I struggle with is I have a firm belief that a student who stims on an iPad, if they were fully verbal, they would be scripting and stimming verbally. So this is something that I think it's important that people understand, that they're just using that as a different way to do it. But if they were verbal, they would still be scripting and they would still be stimming over and over. This is just how they're doing it.
Yeah, totally. And I'll throw another strategy out there is that this is kind of a long game strategy, but it's something that it's a behavior you want to teach. So, but you teach them not to do that, you know? And so like a social situation story where you read stories over and over about the appropriate way to use your device and how I use words, and you read that over and over again is teaching them how to use the device as opposed to just taking it away.
Yeah, no, I want to add on to that. One of the very smart special educators I work with has done a lot of social stories with kids like that about wait time. Mm-hmm. And in the communication and sort of just not pressing a bunch of buttons, but, you know, you need to wait and hear what I'm saying and think for a second. And then you need to have calm hands. It's been very, very, very successful with a couple of students. It's been impressive to see.
That's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. I think there's two more principles here and then we'll wrap up. Okay. Is that
Sure.
One is repetition with moderate differences is important to avoid habituation.
Right. And so this, I think, is something that came up with in the 2016 agreements, and we wordsmithed this a little bit. We edited it, refined it, and just really felt like so that students understand and can generalize a term, you can't use it the same way all the time. Mm-hmm. You have to use it with some slight differences so that students can recognize the different ways a word can be used.
Mm-hmm. Totally. All right. And then the last one is motor planning is an important consideration of an organizational structure of an AAC system. So,
I'm gonna jump in one more time, Shaun, and then see if you want to add in. This is fascinating to me because, Chris, you and I had such strong conversations about this back and forth. I mean, Words for Life is such a strong motor planning app, and I had a conversation today about it and the fact that they have their 84 buttons and they don't move them. But at the same time, in the 2 years since that you and I had those conversations, both ProLoco to Go and TouchChat have modified their system to increase the fact that their buttons move less when you increase the grid size, which are huge changes, right? Mm-hmm. So they're going to, if you go from a 24 button array to a 36 or 25 to 36 maybe, or something like that, then they're going to try to keep things in the same quadrant that they were in and still expand them so that it's not as much relearning. Now, I do think that it's interesting. That's the conversation I had today with my executive director of student support. There are no agreements about this. There are some definite thoughts about, okay, when we have a smaller vocab, we're going to have a smaller array. and then we're going to grow that array, and we're going to try to keep things in the same region, versus we're going to have that array and we're going to hide things so everything's always in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
At the same point, everyone recognizes that automaticity is important.
Shaun, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I obviously agree with this. This is something that's important to me and that I use in all my explanations of AAC apps and explaining modal planning and the importance of modal planning. And it's something still like I run into quite a few, especially SLPs, that have a hard time wrapping their head around it. That, you're not necessarily teaching language. A lot of them believe that you're teaching the modal plan. And so this is something that I get into a lot of conversations about with this one, even though I obviously believe that modal planning is very important. And I think it's we really have to focus on it a lot. I do run into a lot of resistance with this.
You do? In what way?
Just the language part, with people thinking, well, you're not necessarily teaching, it doesn't feel like you're teaching language. You're not teaching semantics. You're not teaching how, different words mean different things. And I try and explain it the best I can. But there are other people, I'll explain to other people, and they seem to really take it. I find I have the most issue explaining this to SLPs versus like teachers and parents.
Right. I think if you're not an SLP, you can relate to it a little bit easier in some ways. You see more of the forest than the trees in some ways, because you recognize, playing a musical instrument, driving a car, reading a book, all of these things have motor planning in them that become automatic, that allow you to focus on the content.
Do you have any ideas, either of you, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but of how to keep the conversation going on a more global level?
I do think that a national or an international body needs to take it up. It would be great if they would, at least, and have some people put together, hey, here's some agreements we think that are important, it almost needs to be a State of the Union address for AAC. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of research being done. There's a lot of talk. And honestly, the people who are teaching communication on a day-to-day basis in small schools throughout the world aren't getting it all.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of poor practice being done. And I think if we started top down, we could do a better job of guiding people. And again, that UNC Chapel group has a whole bunch of online trainings. That's just core. But they talk about modeling. And so, that some of these resources are starting to come out that are research-based. It would be great if we could get a broader agreement document that is research-based and vetted and agreed to by a larger governing body.
Those are really good points. And Chris brought up online, which I think makes the world a much smaller place and gives us the ability to kind of have these discussions, right? So just kind of at the frontline levels with teachers and therapists and parents all over the world, using things like, I know you guys are talking with tech, have a Facebook group, having conversations there, having conversations on the AT chat, Twitter, things like that, gives a way for everyone to kind of put their input on it on a more frontline level.
I love all of these ideas. Guys, thank you so much for taking your time to come and be on Talking with Tech and talk about these agreements and talk about your experiences.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much to Shaun and Chris for joining us. I think that was a really fantastic conversation. And thanks, of course, to Chris Begay for making it happen. We'd like to hear from you too, right?
Yeah, so I feel like we talked about a lot of really great stuff today, and I'm just curious if we missed anything that's really glaring and important. So go to our Facebook group. You can just search Talking with Tech and we'll pop up and leave. Maybe we'll have a photo so we can have some comments on it when we post this episode. And just tell us what you think, because I know for a fact we've missed a lot of things. So we would love to hear from you.
You know what? I'd be really curious to see what their 5 things would be. What would their top 5 list be? And then we can compare and contrast them. That would be awesome.
Well, once again, for Talking with Tech, this is Lucas Stuber, joined by Rachel Madel and Chris Begay. We'll talk to you next week.